Lord Sauron.
It is August 2nd to 16 BC. Somewhere in the hills south of the river Ophidius, two figures could be seen, creeping through the undergrowth, surrounded by the sounds of the forest. Accompanied by his father, a young boy was learning to hunt. Spotting their prey, the father whispered, "Nature is to be feared as much as it is to be revered, and glory awaits those who temper it. Now, you will become a man." As the boy trained his bow, the deer jolted and ran off. The pair looked around to see what startled the animal. As their ears perked up, screams. The sound of screams in the distance caught their attention. To their amazement, just beyond the brush, in the plain below, taking place was what seemed like an enormous battle near the town of Cannae. Hannibal, now spending his second winter in Italy, was commanding an undefeated army that inflicted losses on the Romans more severe than those suffered in the First Punic War, destroying several armies, marching across Italy at will, pillaging and setting the rich countryside ablaze, seemingly unopposed. Rome's scorched earth tactics of the year prior, intended to starve Hannibal's army, hadn't succeeded. His unchallenged presence in Italy was a humiliation for the Republic, and, at least politically, successes in Spain and Sicily were mere consolations. But Fabius' dictatorship, despite failing in its primary objective, provided Rome time to recover and oversaw the rebuilding of the field army, now under temporary command of Ceruleus and Regulus. However, feeling the economic impact of Hannibal's operations and fearing defections from its allies, during the winter, the Senate mobilized the Republic's resources. Two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, would hold joint command over the largest army Rome had ever put to field, with troops assembled and trained across Italy over the coming months. As recruits were organized into legions, commanding officers appointed, drills conducted, and oaths taken, a sense of trust developed between the men and their leaders, gradually building a confident and effective force that was grimly determined to destroy the Carthaginian army in Italy. Into 16 BC. 8 overstrength legions, each numbering 5,000 troops, were raised. 40,000 Roman infantry and 2,400 cavalry would form the core of the massive army. Along with each legion, there would be an equal number of allied infantry, 40,000 in total, along with around 4,000 cavalry. All told, a host nearly 87,000 strong was assembled. A third of the Senate would serve in the army for the campaign up to 16 BC, while most of the remaining senators sent their sons or relatives to join the legions. A very large number of equestrians, the Roman aristocracy, also joined, and numerous distinguished men served as military tribunes or as war counselors to one of the consuls. Of the appointed tribunes, 4 would go on to become consuls, while 3 out of 4 praetors that were elected that year were all former consuls themselves, with some of them having held field commands in previous wars. These were experienced men who reached maturity in the First Punic War, whose honor and tradition bound them to offer their services to Rome, realizing that the very idea of war maritima was now in jeopardy. For Hannibal, being in hostile territory and supplying an army of some 50,000 soldiers and 10,000 cavalry horses, as well as servants, wives, and camp followers, was a never-ending problem that dictated the activities of a network of foraging parties and movements of the army. But thanks to Hannibal's logistical mindset, enough provisions were gathered at Geronium to last around 6 months, from late autumn 217 until spring up to 16 BC, and now the year's crops were ripe enough to be harvested by his troops during campaign season. In early June, Hannibal left his winter quarters, descending from the Apennines into the fertile region of Apulia, with the Roman army following at a distance. After observing Hannibal's activities for several months, the two temporary consuls were asking for instructions from the Senate, now that the Carthaginians were on the move again, explaining that staying close to the enemy could force them into a battle. The Senate instructed them to wait until consuls Paulus and Varro arrived with their legions. This allowed the Carthaginian army to pillage their way through Apulia. For a third year in a row, Hannibal continued his campaign of violence to demonstrate Rome's inability to defend itself and its allies, in the hope that the continued perception of the Republic's weakness would cause defections and rebellions among its allies in southern Italy. Therefore, seeking a decisive battle against Hannibal was a logical decision for the Romans. Prior defeats had not yet diminished their spirit, and their resources were sufficient to continue the war. Upon joining the two temporary consuls, Paulus and Varro led the combined force south along the coastal plain to confront Hannibal. The two Roman commanders carefully scouted the route ahead, with riders patrolling the open country north of the river Ophidius to ensure that no ambush against them could succeed. The clouds of dust thrown up by the massive marching column was visible up to 10 kilometers away. Meanwhile, after raiding Apulia for about 7 weeks, Hannibal was considering his next move. His scouts must have informed him of the large force he would have to face, and he knew that a Roman victory in a single battle could stop his invasion and end any hopes of winning the war. Without any allies in southern Italy, if his army was dealt even a limited defeat, it would have been difficult for it to survive, too far from its bases in Spain, and the tribes of Cisalpine Gaul, where supplies could be drawn from. Any significant losses of men in battle couldn't be replaced, and would diminish Hannibal's ability to plunder the countryside and wage war on the Romans. This would have resulted in lower rations and lack of payment for the troops, which would have certainly caused some of the contingents to lose heart and desert. Another rumor circled in Rome that Hannibal drew up a contingency plan, in case of defeat, to abandon the army and flee north with his cavalry, in the hope of cutting his way to Cisalpine Gaul. Whether or not this was true is impossible to say, but by mid-July Hannibal captured the town of Cannae. While it wasn't the wealthiest nor largest settlement in the area, and was now abandoned, having suffered in the last year's campaign, Cannae was used by the Roman army as a supply depot. Capturing it, along with gathering the produce from the surrounding area, secured plentiful provisions for the troops, which reduced the need to forage for some time. For the next several weeks, the Carthaginian general sat and waited for the Romans. Situated on a hilltop, Cannae was a good vantage point, overlooking the flat plain in the direction from which the Roman army would come. One of the Carthaginian officers, by the name of Gisco, nervously commented on the size of the enemy army. Undoubtedly, he wasn't the only one in the Carthaginian army that was intimidated by the size of the Roman host. But, ever the master of mind games, Hannibal wittily remarked, "The thing that has escaped your notice is that, although there are so many of them, there is not one among them called Gisco," thereby bolstering the confidence of the men and diffusing the tension into laughter. Although there was nothing stopping the Carthaginian general from continuing south, where more plunder could have been taken, he was aware that the Romans were coming, and that he could not be perceived as trying to avoid battle, for no community in southern Italy would defect to his side if he lacked confidence in defeating Rome. At Cannae, Hannibal's objective was to meet and destroy the Romans. The enthusiastic Roman vanguard rushed forward. The pursuit lacked organization, but for once they caught the Carthaginian general off guard, and they were not about to allow him time to consolidate. But, while Hannibal's standard did leave the camp, the Carthaginian general was in fact lurking in the forest nearby. He lured the Romans into an ambush yet again, despite their extensive scouting efforts. Panic gripped the Romans, and it seemed like another disaster was afoot. But Consul Varro quickly rallied the troops and reformed the lines, managing to beat back the Carthaginians. Hannibal committed significant forces in an effort to destroy the Roman vanguard and shatter the morale of the Republic's army in yet another ambush. But the legionaries he met on that rainy morning showed the kind of determination he hadn't faced before. It's late July to 16 BC as the Roman column approached. Word reached Paulus and Varro that the supply depot at Cannae fell into Carthaginian hands. The two consuls were alarmed by the news, knowing that Hannibal now had the resources to camp throughout the winter with little need to forage or pillage the surrounding area for supplies. This would keep the Carthaginians sheltered and rested, and would undoubtedly help Hannibal maintain high morale among the troops over the coming months. Meanwhile, Paulus and Varro were aware that, with their logistics disrupted, maintaining and supplying their vast army in the field would present numerous problems. From their perspective, a well-supplied Hannibal could now, in theory, try to play for time and prolong the war well into next year, which would give him plenty of opportunities to gain political points and successfully persuade Rome's allies in southern Italy to join him. For the Roman leadership, the thought of a possible cascade of defections on their peninsula was unacceptable. Hannibal had to be dealt with. However, while surveying the battlefield, disputes began over where to fight the planned battle. To the south lay Cannae on a line of hills, with undulated land beneath the hillsides, and the very flat plain north of the river Ophidius. In ancient times, the river itself is suspected to have had a different course, which ran further away from the hills, and the area surrounding it was mostly treeless cultivated open country, much like today. Paulus wasn't pleased with the ground, arguing that the flat terrain favored Hannibal's more numerous and better cavalry, expressing his preference to move the camp into the hills to the west, where the more broken ground would be more suited to infantry and would restrict cavalry maneuvers. Varro disagreed, correctly pointing out that the legions performed best on fairly open ground, expressing his willingness to give battle even in the open country north of the river, despite Hannibal's superiority in cavalry, but arguing that deploying the army in the undulated terrain south of Ophidius would also suit the Roman infantry, whilst the river and the hills would restrict any extensive Carthaginian cavalry maneuvers on the flanks. Both consuls were clearly concerned about the mobility of Hannibal's cavalry. Varro was certainly more eager to fight, and contemporary sources put this down to inexperience, whilst describing Paulus as the more level-headed of the two. But Paulus' plan was problematic in many ways. The Roman host was very large and was composed of a mix between newly trained troops and more experienced legionaries, which made movements, maneuvers and deployments of the army a slow process, which would have been even slower in the broken ground that Paulus suggested, despite other advantages such terrain would offer. In addition, it is doubtful that Hannibal would accept a battle against a numerically superior army in a well-defended position and suited for his cavalry. He would have likely arrayed his troops in the plain below to taunt and challenge the Romans, and if they didn't come down from the hillsides to fight, he would use this as propaganda to show off the Republic's weakness to its Italian allies. Worse, Paulus' plan to move into the hills to the west meant that the Romans would perhaps be forced to wait until an opportunity for a battle arose, and that could have potentially kept the army in the field for a long time. Feeding and supplying so many troops for a prolonged period would have been a major problem, whilst Hannibal now held the most important supply depot in the area, at Cannae, and could afford to wait. In addition, it is unlikely that Paulus completely refused the idea of giving battle on the flat terrain, because just like Varro, he understood that the Roman camp was already too close to Hannibal. Therefore, repositioning to the western hills would essentially require them to disengage. But any withdrawal from the field in the face of the enemy was very difficult and dangerous, especially for an army dominated by infantry that faced superior cavalry, who could pick them off piecemeal and potentially cause a rout. Furthermore, despite being in open country, Retreating from an outnumbered enemy would be deeply dispiriting for the troops, especially given that the Senate, the army, and the people of Rome wanted to fight and destroy Hannibal. In every sense, the Roman army was now committed and could not easily pull away from the field without a battle. Therefore, whatever misgivings Paulus had, Varro's preference to fight as soon as possible was not at all unreasonable. Under the circumstances, the two consuls came from very different backgrounds. Paulus was the grandfather of Scipio Aemilianus, who was the principal financier of the famous Greek historian Polybius, the main contemporary source for the Second Punic War. Being paid by Paulus' immensely influential and wealthy family, it is easy to see why Polybius portrayed the consul in such a positive light, claiming that it was he who solely raised the morale of the army and made major efforts to organize the newly formed legions, whilst mentioning Varro only in passing as his colleague, not including him in his writings at all during the campaign until Hannibal was sighted. And even then Varro is portrayed as somewhat of an inexperienced hothead, in contrast to the supposedly more sensible Paulus. This can make it difficult to separate propaganda from the truth. However, it is true that Paulus had more military experience, having previously served as consul into 19 BC and was campaigning in Illyria. But, after being involved in a scandal with the distribution of war plunder, he was keen to avoid further stains on his reputation in his second consulship into 16 BC, which may have been part of the reason for his cautiousness prior to the battle. In military terms, the Illyrian War was a combined operation between the navy and the army, but there were no pitched battles. So despite the demands this campaign must have had on Paulus as a general, the conflict in Illyria did not require the skills needed for controlling a massive field army. And since his reputation was embellished in contemporary sources, we have no reliable way of knowing how good of a commander he was. In contrast, Varro was a novus homo, a new man, one of the very few in any generation of Roman political circles to be the first in their family to reach high office. Contemporary sources further smear him by describing his ancestry as humble and poor, claiming that his father was a butcher and that Varro himself worked in the shop during his youth. Despite being described as a brutish simpleton, in reality a new man had substantial political ability to win elections against opponents from old prominent Roman families and their many clients who voted for them. Varro could not parade the achievements and high status of his ancestors and had to find other ways of making his name known to the public, in a voting system that heavily favored the rich, which in a way made him an underdog. This shows that Varro must have been a shrewd politician who managed to gain the support of influential aristocrats and senators, all of whom looked to invest in a candidate that would aggressively confront Hannibal, a desire that was widespread in all political circles in Rome. In addition, changes to Roman laws into 17 BC made it nearly impossible for a consular candidate without military experience to be elected, regardless of the influence and prestige of his financiers. So while Varro never held senior command, considering the serious crisis that Rome was in at this stage of the war, it is reasonable to assume that he could not have been made consul without certain military qualifications. On the second day came Varro's turn to command. He led the army towards a position closer to the enemy, despite objections from his colleague. Hannibal responded by sending out groups of cavalry and light infantry to harass and slow down the advancing enemy column. Seeing the incoming Carthaginians, Varro closed ranks and the column only barely continued to move forward. A series of skirmishes caused significant confusion in the Roman ranks, but Varro's formed close order infantry drove back each attack. The sporadic fighting went on until dark, without either side gaining an edge or inflicting losses on the enemy, but the Roman progress to a new campsite slowed down to a crawl, because they were forced to maintain a constant fighting line, eventually encamping when night fell. Paulus, still supposedly reluctant to give battle in this terrain, took charge of the army next morning and continued the advance towards the site chosen for the main camp, marshalling the troops to close the distance with the Carthaginians. Meanwhile, Hannibal was still positioned on high ground near Cannae, south of the river, observing enemy movements without taking any action. The Romans proceeded to aggressively take control over the battlefield. 2/3 of the army remained in the main camp, while the remaining 1/3 of the troops was sent across the river Ophidius. Setting up a second camp showed the determination of the Roman leadership to put pressure on the movement of enemy troops, whilst taking up a position from where they could protect their own foraging parties that ventured closer to Cannae. More importantly, this aggressive stance served to build up the confidence of the troops. Hannibal countered by advancing down from the high ground towards a new camp location, most likely the flat plateau atop a ridge west of the main Roman camp, leaving a garrison to guard the fortified depot at Cannae. The size of the Roman host was clearly on his mind, as he continuously spoke to the men, encouraging them that this is why they came to Italy, challenging the Romans for control over. The battlefield showed Hannibal's belief in victory, which raised the spirits of the men. The new camp was in a fairly good defensive position, overlooking the plain below, with the river nearby offering the crucial water supply. On the last day of July, the Carthaginian general ordered the troops to prepare for battle. The camp was abuzz for much of the late afternoon, as the men sharpened their blades, cleaned their weapons, armor, and clothing, wanting to look their best and most intimidating once the battle commenced. Early on August 1st, the Carthaginian army marched out of their camp. On the Roman side, Paulus was once again in command. He posted covering forces in front of the palisades of each camp, but the legions stayed close to the ramparts, and little was done to provoke a battle. Hannibal, meanwhile, took the initiative and dispatched his Numidians across the river to attack the secondary Roman camp. He kept the rest of the troops arrayed for battle, facing the enemy camp for several hours. He exploited Paulus' reluctance to give battle to raise the confidence of his troops by impressing upon them that the Romans lacked the will to fight. Across the river, the Numidians were ordered not to press the camp directly, but to harass the foraging parties, mostly consisting of servants gathering water supplies, and chase them from the field. For Hannibal, this was another way to humiliate the Romans and show to his troops the inability of the enemy to counter the Numidian raid and protect their foragers. Some of the Roman officers felt ashamed with how the day went, resolutely wanting to turn things around, and the troops were especially displeased with the delay. Undoubtedly, the two consuls read the mood of the camp, and on August 2nd, Varro decided to fight. On a sweltering August 2nd, the battle standard in front of Varro's tent signaled to the troops to array for battle, as the gusts of southwesterly volcanic wind raised clouds of fine dust across the dry Apulian soil. For the next several hours, army officers closely supervised the complex deployment to ensure that the legions would form in the correct order. Varro and the rest of the Roman leadership decided to show the enemy their willingness to fight. However, they had no way of knowing if the Carthaginians would accept a battle in this new location. But then Hannibal led his troops through the gates. The two armies crossed the river Ophidius at various points and marched onto the dust-blown flat plain below the town of Cannae. Yet, the Romans still weren't sure that Hannibal would give battle, so they left a 10,000-strong garrison in the main camp. It was Paulus who insisted on this, arguing that, besides guarding the baggage, this force could also threaten Hannibal's camp and cut off his line of retreat once the battle went in favor of the Romans. However, Hannibal wasted no time in deploying his army, sending out his light troops to form a protective screen for the main body. Varro to send out the velites to mask the process of deployment from the enemy. There are suggestions that the Roman leadership didn't actually expect the more mobile Carthaginians to fight on such a narrow and confined battlefield. and merely wanted to deploy the legions in front of the enemy to boost morale and rebuild their confidence, after being humiliated the day before for refusing to fight. Such practices of building up the confidence of the men were common in the battles of this period, but it is far more probable that the Romans did, in fact, fully intend to fight this battle on the ground of their own choosing. Whatever the case, Hannibal is said to have had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 horse, while the Romans fielded around 70,000 infantry and 6,400 cavalry. Varro placed a screen of around 15,000 villages in front of the main line. 4,000 allied horse were positioned on the left under his direct command, while Paulus was in charge of the 2,400 Roman cavalry deployed on the right. To compensate for their numerical inferiority, the squadrons of horsemen were packed in a tighter formation, with no more than 1.5 meters between each rider. Room to maneuver the horses wasn't necessary, but their role would be purely defensive while the infantry drove the attack forward. Regular Roman infantry was mixed with the cavalry to give more stability to the static squadrons. Ceruleus commanded the 55,000 Roman legionaries and allied troops in the center, arrayed in a much deeper and more tightly packed triplex aces. Varro used the overstrength maniples to add depth to the infantry formations. Furthermore, he reduced the gaps between the lines to bring the full weight of the legions to bear, aiming to overwhelm the enemy. He knew that, at Trasimene, the Roman heavy infantry held off the Carthaginians for hours, inflicting significant losses, despite being in an unfavorable position. And the year prior to that at Trebia, the legions hacked their way through the Carthaginian center, getting the better of both the Gauls and several contingents of Libyans, Hannibal's best infantry. It's worth noting that the tighter maniple formations restricted the tactical flexibility, but eased the coordination of the massive army and, more importantly, the deeper formations possessed longer endurance in a direct confrontation. Thus, the Roman leadership was confident that the legions can outmatch the enemy and crush Hannibal's center yet again. To achieve this, Varro chose the battlefield wisely. He packed the legions on a narrow front, with the river and the hills near Cannae protecting the flanks from envelopment. This would force the Carthaginian horsemen into a frontal charge, and the Roman cavalry was tasked with delaying long enough for the legions to finish the job. If they could break through the Punic center, it wouldn't matter if the weaker Roman horse lost the fight on the wings, because at that point the Carthaginian cavalry couldn't do much more than harass the large block of legions. The selection of the battleground at Cannae could allow the heavy infantry to smash their Punic enemy. We do not know if Varro alone planned this, or if he was assisted by Paulus, Ceruleus, and other members of the Roman leadership. The Roman plan was simple, but efficient. Meanwhile, Hannibal placed around 6,000 Spanish skirmishers and up to 2,000 renowned Balearic slingers as a screening force in front of the army, instructing them to raise as much dust as possible to hide the disposition of the troops. Behind them formed the close order infantry, with 21,000 Gallic warriors making up the bulk of the main line. 3,000 veteran Spanish infantry were interspersed to strengthen the center, but unlike at Trebia, where his main line collapsed because he amassed all of his infantry to try and match the Romans, and didn't keep any reserves for decisive action and to plug the gaps in the line. This time he positioned the 8,000 Libyans, his best, most disciplined men, in the rear, hiding them from view behind the formations in the front. On the Punic right were 4,000 Numidian horsemen, commanded by Cannae, tasked with holding the flank, while on the opposite side, the Carthaginian general placed 2,000 Spanish and 4,000 Gallic cavalry, under the command of Hasdrubal, planning to overload the left flank in a direct attack on the Roman right, hoping to smash the enemy cavalry and threaten the legions from the rear. Neither side was intimidated by the other. Gallic and Spanish troops had the confidence of past victories against the legions, while the Romans trusted in their superior numbers. remembering that even in prior defeats, their heavy infantry often prevailed in hand-to-hand combat against the Punic troops. Then, around midday, like a lumbering beast, the Roman formation moved forward. The Carthaginian cavalry on the left led the line, trotting at pace, while the light infantry of both armies moved ahead of the main lines to open the engagement. Now, hidden behind the dust raised by the scream of skirmishers, Hannibal made his move, advancing with the main line to form a crescent formation that would bulge towards the enemy. He understood that the Romans chose this narrow battlefield to deploy their army as a battering ram, and that his outnumbered infantry stood no chance of stopping the legions if they tried matching them man for man. Therefore, the bulged line was supposed to absorb the attack and then slowly retreat, to buy time until the cavalry attack on the left unfolded. Hannibal personally commanded the troops in the centre with the help of his youngest brother Mogga, for these troops would bear the brunt of the Roman assault, and it was vital that they held out as long as possible. As the skirmishing between the light troops began in the middle of the field, Carthaginian riders on the left advanced full tilt towards the Roman citizen cavalry. With veteran officers leading the way, the Spanish and Gallic squadrons stayed compact, doubling up on and dispersing the first lines of Roman horsemen, quickly penetrating their formation. Some of the Roman riders dismounted to fight on foot, but the Carthaginians swarmed their positions, dragging their opponents from their seats. But despite outnumbering the Romans 3-1, the confined space largely negated the numerical advantage of the Punic riders, and Hasdrubal did well to tightly control his men, managing to overwhelm the Romans in a brief furious charge. The Roman cavalry couldn't cope and most of them broke and fled, with the Carthaginians now in hot pursuit. Others huddled together to hold off the Punic onslaught for as long as possible. Paulus himself escaped the carnage with his retinue and moved to rejoin the fighting in the centre. Meanwhile, on the opposite flank, the Numidians pinned down the allied Italian cavalry with hit and run attacks, with neither side able to gain an advantage. In the centre, after a long exchange of projectiles, the skirmishers retreated behind the close order infantry as the Roman legions closed in. The massed ranks of legionaries must have been an intimidating sight, advancing slowly while clashing their weapons against the wooden shields, whilst the trumpeters added to the cacophony of noise, as an almost solid mass of rank upon rank of armoured legionaries clashed with the enemy. Hannibal's advance centre narrowed the width of the initial contact, reducing the deadly momentum of the Roman attack. The bare-chested Gauls, hacking at the enemy with their long slashing swords, and the Spanish in their white tunics, thrusting forward with their short blades, stood firm and held back the enemy for a time. But as more Roman troops entered the fray, the weight of the legions drove back the mixed Punic formation. Roman velites supported the attack, while the Carthaginian light footmen were ordered to reinforce the flanks of the infantry. Hannibal and his officers barked orders at the men, telling them to stand off the Roman assault and slowly move back, already overwhelmed by the wall of Scutum shields, pushing them back, ordering the troops to retreat further in the face of the enemy was fraught with risks. All it would take is a few men buckling under pressure to cause slight cracks in the line that could quickly break the formation and turn into a rout. But the Carthaginian general and his Punic captains led from the front, fighting alongside the troops in the first lines, encouraging the men to hold their nerve, carefully controlling their withdrawal. Hannibal knew that he had to stay in the fight and buy time until events elsewhere on the field unfolded. And for now, the line held close to the hills on the right. The light Numidian horsemen fought in small groups, throwing their javelins and rapidly retreating before the enemy could pin them down. However, their attacks caused very little damage, and pharaohs simply remained in place, making no effort to drive them back. The main role of the Roman cavalry was to prevent the enemy from flanking the infantry formation long enough until the main assault of the legions broke through the centre. But, on the other flank, The superior Carthaginian horse have by now decimated the Roman cavalry, completely routing them from the field. Next, Hasdrubal could move against the rear of the Roman centre and help surround Varos. Allied cavalry on the right, but first, he had to regroup and allow his men and horses time to rest, who were by now exhausted from pursuing the fleeing enemy cavalry. Back in the centre, as the Carthaginian infantry fell back before them, the Romans pressed on, prodding and cutting through the retreating enemy line. Sword in hand, the centurions and tribunes shouted orders through the deafening noise of the screams and the clattering of weapons, urging the maniples to charge together, sending more and more men into the concave Punic centre, which seemed like it will soon break. Conversely, Hannibal and Moggo pushed the men to resist a while longer, trying to gain every precious second, hoping that the Spanish and Gallic cavalry will come to their aid. But as more and more legionaries were drawn inwards, the Roman breakthrough was inevitable, and the pressure on the centre finally broke the Punic line. The Gauls and Spanish had first moved back facing the enemy, with flurries of fighting still occurring, but before long they turned and routed. With the enemy now on the run, Paulus and Ceruleus poured more men into the gap, refusing to give the Carthaginians any chance to rally and reform their lines. The overcrowded Roman centre surged forward into the salient. Hannibal's infantry on either side of the gaping hole managed to maintain their lines, but were nevertheless forced to retreat in good order. Meanwhile, up the field, Hasdrubal had reformed his squadrons and charged at Varos formation, realizing that he could not move against the legions in the centre before the threat of Roman cavalry was removed. Until now, Varos successfully held the flank, but seeing the incoming Carthaginians, the consul knew that the Roman cavalry on the other wing must have routed, and he could not see what was going on in the centre. Unsure if the day was lost and facing annihilation himself against a force 3 times his own, Varro fled the field. The Numidians gave chase, while Hasdrubal once again had to stop to rest and reform his cavalry before he could turn them towards the rear of the Roman infantry. Back in the centre, legionaries in their tens of thousands pressed forward to complete the rout of the enemy. As they advanced into the gap, the maniples lost all cohesion, turning into a disorganized mob that rushed forward, with their officers barely able to control small groups of men in their own immediate vicinity. This mattered little, however, as the Romans could taste victory, having punched straight through the enemy's centre. Hannibal relied on trickery and ruse in his prior victories, but it now seemed that clear field at Cannae offered no possibility for him to set up an ambush. But as the mass of Romans streamed forward, they found themselves between the columns of Libyan infantry that moved against the pursuing troops. Incredibly, the Carthaginian general outwitted the Romans yet again by carefully masking the position of the Libyans behind his troops in the front and using the clouds of dust raised by the fighting. Hannibal concealed his best infantry from the enemy on an open field, luring the greatest army Rome has ever assembled into an ambush set in plain view, in effect letting the legions outflank themselves. As the Libyans pressed the overextended and disorganized mass on both sides, the momentum of the Roman attack dissolved, and the troops were no longer under anyone's control. Hannibal and Moggo rallied most of the routing Gallic and Spanish troops, turning to rejoin the fighting, while on the opposite side of the field, Hasdrubal charged into the rear of the enemy infantry. As the compression of the legions began, the utter defeat of the Roman army was now inevitable. With the maniples hopelessly intermingled, they could no longer reform their lines. To make matters worse, Libyan troops looked similar to Roman legionaries, having been equipped with Roman armour, helmets and shields that they stripped from the dead at Trebia, Trasimene and Geronium. The legionaries felt they were no longer protected on the flanks, and with the enemy seemingly amongst them, their nervousness soon turned to panic. Hannibal turned the strength of the Roman infantry their deep overwhelming formation against them as their ranks contracted under the pressure of multiple attacks, centurions and tribunes tried in vain to improvise, as movement became ever harder in the confined space. Paulus and Cyrenius fought heroically, leading a stiff resistance, but both were eventually cut down during the fighting. Small groups of legionaries tried forming rough formations, but most were too exhausted and stood no chance against the fresh Libyans who were kept in reserve for most of the day. Some of the Roman troops, weary and fatigued, simply gave up, no longer having the strength to raise their weapons. As the hours passed, the battle became a one-sided massacre. The fighting went on until dark, but there was little to no tactical sophistication in this final stage of the battle, as the Carthaginians systematically slaughtered most of the trapped infantry. In the end, widespread Roman resistance collapsed, and those who had any strength left in them managed to flee towards the Roman camps and the nearby towns. Hannibal had won an unbelievable victory. By sundown, some 50,000 Roman infantry and 2,700 cavalry lay dead or dying on the field at Cannae. The gory sight gave pause even to the most hardened of observers, as nearly 3,000 tons of human flesh was left to rot in the August sun, the true fruits of Hannibal's tactical masterpiece. But achieving this slaughter cost Hannibal dearly. 5,700 of his men fell, a high figure for a victorious army in ancient times, which is testament to the harsh fighting on the day, although it is worth noting that the Carthaginians were significantly outnumbered until the very end of the battle, which also played a role in the relatively high casualties for Hannibal's army. Nevertheless, the Roman leadership was decimated. Consul Paulus, Proconsul Cyrenius, and Marcus Minucius Rufus were killed in the battle, along with 80 senators, sequestors, 29 out of 48 military tribunes, some 300 equestrians, with many others captured and enslaved. Never has there been a defeat that struck so hard at the very heart of Roman society. And, as night fell on August 2nd, 216 BC, Rome's very future was left in doubt.
Lord Sauron.